Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Liz Toth, the Director of Alumni Relations, and I'm thrilled today to introduce our webinar panelists today, Amy Impellizeri, class of 1992, who was a corporate litigator and has now become an award-winning and successful author. And with that, Amy, I'm thrilled to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who are tuning in. This is a little unusual for me because I am used to speaking to live people and getting some feedback. So please do feel free to send any questions in the chat box. I'll answer them at the end, and it'll make me feel a little more at home. So thank you. Last spring, I received a very special award. It was an award that came from a legal organization, a group called Ms. JD. And since this legal organization's award actually came a decade after I left the law, it was really humbling, but also, as it turns out, interestingly enough, completely timely. The award you see was the Road Less Traveled Award. And receiving this honor from a group I admired and still do was such a full circle moment for me at this particular time of my life that it was an affirmation of sorts for a journey I had literally started the day after I left my long and hard-fought legal career. And it all started on a not very well-traveled road, literally. Let me back up a bit. I started my college career, my days at Dickinson, with literally only one professional goal: to be a lawyer. But I had also started my college career with the realization that at my core, I was a writer. I had always been a writer. I was the girl who, when I walked in a room, I was narrating the scene in my head. I filled my journals with words. I was a writer. But at some point along the road at Dickinson and later in law school, I determined that I couldn't do both. I couldn't both nurture my creative writing voice and continue on a path in which I was honing my ability to write and think in a client's voice. I decided, and we can argue the merits of that at another time, that I had to pick just one, and I chose the law. And I literally boxed up my journals and I stopped taking creative writing classes, and I focused solely on what I saw as my straight line path to law school. I gave up my own voice, hoping that in turn, I'd be able to find my own path to success. By 2001, I had indeed finished law school and completed a federal clerkship in Washington, D.C. I had completed my first solo jury trial. I had argued several important appeals at the state and federal level. I was 30, and I had just landed what was a highly coveted position at one of the, if not the most prestigious law firms in the country. In 2001, I was also a young lawyer trying to escape a very closed down Manhattan on 9/11. And just 2 months later, on November 12, 2001, I was a young lawyer trying to take a rare Monday off after working around the clock all weekend when a plane crashed on my residential corner in Bell Harbor, New York. My home was commandeered as the command center for the entire recovery operation following the crash of American Airlines Flight 587. And I spent that day with first responders who had been doing shifts at Ground Zero and then coming directly to my town and my home to participate in another very tragic effort. I wanted very much to find the words to comfort them and myself after all these difficult events, but I didn't have the words. It was a hazard of having given up my voice a long time ago. In 2009, I was a senior associate at the Manhattan office of Skadden Arps, and that year I applied for a one-year sabbatical. That is the one-year sabbatical that I'm still on a decade later. The sabbatical program was one that had been instituted in the wake of the Lehman Brothers collapse and the subsequent economic crisis. Given the times we're living in now and the uncertainty that's sort of pervading us now, it may be hard to remember and put ourselves back in a time of other national crises. But I remember vividly the dread and the fear living in the wake of 9/11. And I remember the uncertainty that marked for me personally that time after the plane crash. And I remember that time after the Lehman Brothers collapse, when a lot was in question. And for me, for the first time, I was questioning the next leg of my journey, whether I would continue to be a lawyer. After 13 years of knowing nothing else, I was suddenly unsure whether that was going to be my continued professional path. Some firms were laying off attorneys and other staff, but instead of laying anyone off, Skadden announced that it would accept applications for a subsidized 1-year sabbatical, and I immediately applied. The head of my department originally denied my sabbatical because, unlike other departments like M&A and transactional work where the work had sort of slowed or come to a standstill, I was a litigator, and litigation is completely impervious to economic decline. So I was still very busy, and the head of my department told me emphatically I was simply too busy to take time off. But I did something I was pretty good at by then. I made a strong case, I argued on my own behalf, and I won the battle. I was granted my sabbatical. And so it began. A year in which I found myself with certain responsibilities removed and a boatload of uncertainty and chaos added. It was, looking back on it now, not completely unlike the time I am facing and the time a lot of us are facing right now. So the first thing I did on my sabbatical was to take a trip to the Dominican Republic with my family. And when I first came home, I wrote about the experience in an essay that I've only just recently begun sharing publicly. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share it with you now. It's called Unscathed. I already know what you will think. When I tell you I was not afraid, you will think I am lying, but I wasn't, and I'm not. I was actually thinking to myself, when I later tell the story about the day we, my family and I, willingly climbed into a car that was driven by an unknown armed man, everyone will assume I have lost my marbles. See, that's how you'll know I wasn't afraid. In that moment, I was already thinking about telling the story afterward. I knew we'd make it. I just wasn't sure if you'd believe me. While I'm thinking about how I will later tell this story, we are on the side of a road in a small town halfway between Punta Cana and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. We have pulled over as far as we can on this narrow stretch to let a drug enforcement truck pull ahead of us on the winding dirt road. At least half a dozen men with machine guns at the ready sit perched on the side of the truck as it swerves past us. I try not to make eye contact with any of them. I stare instead at the facades of the small homes not far from our car, not far from the machine guns. My 3 drowsy kids, aged 5 and under, have been sleeping most of the way, but now they stare bleary-eyed at the pastel-colored buildings whose porches are decorated with rows of hanging meats. My 3-year-old son mumbles, "Pretty," and I nod my head in agreement as I rub his head. "Shh," I whisper, "it's okay." And I feel it is somehow, because back home in New York, things have not been okay. Most recently, my well-intentioned efforts to juggle being a full-time mother and a full-time lawyer have left me gasping for breath. Ostensibly, we are here to spend our first week of my year-long sabbatical from corporate law on a well-needed family vacation. But that's not why we're here, right here. It's so much more specific than that. And if my husband has connected the dots, he does not say so, although in my own mind, it all seems so obvious. He doesn't ask why I've brought us here, not when I make the reservations, not when we get into the rented car at the airport, not when the driver claims he is off-duty policia as he unassumingly stows a firearm in the glove box, not when we pull over on our way to the Punta Cana resort to let a heavily armed drug enforcement truck pass us on this small foreign road. I take in all of the sights and sounds, and I feel at peace, armed driver, machine guns, and all. I look around at the countryside, equal parts beautiful and hard, and I close my eyes and I think to myself, I did not survive a plane crash 8 years ago to die here or now. I was at home in Belle Harbor, New York on November 12, 2001, when American Airlines Flight 587 crashed on the corner where I lived. That morning, after my husband left for work, I woke to the sound of a low-flying plane. After a few moments of listening to the too close jet engine, I got out of bed and headed to the window. I don't know what I was looking for, but here's what I saw. A dark cylindrical object plummeting from the sky a few blocks away. The falling engine of a plane that was gradually breaking apart only moments after lifting off from New York City's Kennedy Airport. After a few moments of screeching and darkness, the plane cast an enormous shadow as it passed directly over my head. Flight 587 crashed across the street from where I was standing. At the moment of impact, I remember instinctively ducking, hands thrown over my head as if I could somehow avoid being crushed by the plane in this position. It worked. The plane missed me. After all was said and done that morning on the corner of 131st and Newport Avenues, our house was the only one of the 4 corner houses left standing, completely unscathed, while the crash had killed everyone on board Flight 587 and 5 of my neighbors on the ground. Our house became the command center for the recovery operation for Flight 587, and it always surprises me that all these years later, I still feel grateful, proud, and guilty relating that fact. November 12, 2001 became the median point of my life, and everything else was either before or after this central day. And I was haunted by the tragedy. Every morning I would read over the makeshift memorials the passengers' families created at the site, photos and candles and letters and cards dedicated to the victims. I mourned them. I thought about them. I prayed for them. Every day I carried around the memories of these people I had never known, would never know. These people traveling to a place I had never been, a place that was home to many of the passengers on board. Flight 587 had been headed to the Dominican Republic. When we moved from the crash site nearly a year later, I was still trying to give meaning to my own survival. I focused on my law career, but wanted more. I poured myself into motherhood as my children began arriving 2 years after the crash. Yet even the needful voices of my 3 children did little to drown out the ghostly echoes. Survivor's guilt prevented me from slowing down for even a moment as I struggled to deserve my children, my career, and my life. In 2009, exhausted, I took a sabbatical from corporate law, and only then did I realize what must be done. I booked a flight to the Dominican Republic with my family to see and honor the homeland of many of the victims of the horrific crash that had been haunting me for 8 long years. I hired a driver to navigate through the countryside from Santo Domingo to the resort town of Punta Cana. I wanted to see more than the scrubbed down walls of the tourist resort. A full circle moment, if ever there was one. It would have been impossible and highly ungrateful to be fearful that day, which is why I knowingly climbed into the car with the armed driver, believing him when he said he was off-duty policia, and why I refused to allow the machine guns and large black garbage bags full of recovered cartel-related drugs to distract me from the beauty that was all around. Sitting there on the side of the road, instead of being afraid, I suddenly felt silly for believing myself a survivor, and worse, feeling guilty simply because I had not died when a plane crashed on my street corner 8 years earlier. After the machine guns were finally out of view, our driver resumed his course along the pretty but rough countryside, and my children awakened noisily. Are we almost there? I'm hungry. Did you remember my blanket? My brother is touching me. I have to pee. And in the noisy din of that car, I realized with a smile that the ghosts were quiet and the silence was beautiful. And so it was on that trip, on a road not very well traveled, that I found my voice. As I said, I came home from the Dominican Republic and I wrote that essay. And just this act, the writing of those words, the first thing I'd written in my own voice in nearly 20 years, unlocked something in me. I kept writing. I started a novel that, granted, took many years to finish and longer still to sell. But still, that novel and my subsequent writing career, it all started during that moment on that road less traveled. During that period of uncertainty and chaos in my own life, in which I was able to quiet my brain with gratitude just long enough to see the opportunity. It may have started with a vacation, but that sabbatical of mine definitely wasn't a vacation. After juggling a full-time career and 3 children, I was suddenly a stay-at-home mother of 3 with a host of new challenges. I won't bore you with them here, but suffice to say there were challenges for me both personally and professionally. I made up my mind for it to be a very deliberate, intentional year, and that meant hustling for new freelance business writing opportunities and other business opportunities. It meant carving out boundaries in and for my family life, evaluating pro bono assignments and taking some new assignments on, and making sure to keep the lines of communication open with my colleagues at Skadden, just in case. There were things that were stripped away from my days, but many new challenges and hurdles took their place. Again, not completely unlike the time I'm facing and that many of us are facing right now. But with the screeching halt of one aspect of my life, my legal career, there was opportunity. I never went back to the practice of law. That 1-year sabbatical became a 3-year leave of absence and became an executive position with a startup company, later nonprofit work, and a writing career that has seen 5 novels published with Wyatt Mackenzie Publishing and 1 nonfiction title published by the American Bar Association's publishing arm. That 1-year sabbatical turned into a writing residency with Ms. JD and later a special recognition with their Road Less Traveled Award. In the last few weeks, I've sifted through the current crisis to find the opportunity as well. Much about my own personal and professional life has been thrown into complete chaos, as I'm sure yours has. My 3 children's academic schedules have been completely disrupted and had to be completely re-engineered. Spring sports seasons and all social interaction as they know it has ceased. My oldest child's highly sought after and summer job and internship opportunity that he worked so hard for is now in jeopardy, as is his driver's license. My son's middle school graduation and all the ceremonial milestones he was so excited about have gone away. My most recent novel released to humbling accolades, but nearly 0 press, as my book tour and all events were canceled within days of the book's release. My husband is a physician who's trying to navigate the new demands of his profession during an unprecedented health crisis. And neither of us has been able to see or hug our aging parents in over a month. And yet, I've worked really hard to quiet my brain with gratitude in order to see the opportunity in all of this. An opportunity that hopefully only comes around once in a lifetime, although for me, it does seem to come around every decade or so. I'm writing. I'm working in earnest on a book that is a lane change and a departure for me, a risk I probably wouldn't have been brave enough to take a few months ago. I'm reconnecting with my children in a new and special way and trying to help them reconnect with friends and loved ones in new ways as well. I'm having coffee that does not come from a drive-through on my own porch every single morning in quiet. Just this month, I signed 2 exciting new contracts, one as an adjunct professor for a remote MFA program in creative writing, and one for a nonfiction book that I'm going to be co-authoring for transitioning attorneys in the post-COVID world, proving to myself yet again that these 2 parts of my brain, the creative writing and the legal writing, can actually exist in harmony if I let them. So tell me, how about you? What opportunities have you found during this time? I would love to hear about them and continue the dialogue about them. I will put my email address in the comments here. I'd love to stay in touch, and I'd love for us to keep finding new ways to quiet the chaos and find the opportunity in our current situations. I have to be honest with you, it's been a decade since I found my voice, and I am determined never to lose it again. I wish the same for all of you. So thank you for your kind attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Otherwise, we certainly can keep in touch virtually.
Amy, we have our first question.
Yeah.
It is very interesting life course. Do you feel you currently write more for your inner self or more for the public in general, or both?
Interesting. So A little of both. I do feel that I've often said the books that I wrote in the last decade, the fiction books set end to end, are sort of like my memoir of that time. And I always say too that I'm not brave enough to write nonfiction, which is why I write fiction. So there's a lot in my fiction that involves questions that I'm trying to answer for myself, but I try to hopefully do it in a way that will be relatable and have be surrounded by a story that makes it, you know, if not universal, more widely appealing. But for sure, there's a lot of personal soul seeking in my books. But the connection that I get from having other people read them and then discussing, you know, sort of how my words impacted them or how they took them in a completely individual way is very gratifying. So a little of both, yeah.
The next question. When you felt you had to choose one path, law or writing, do you think that feeling came from within or from outside pressures telling you couldn't do both?
Well, I can tell you, I remember the exact moment. There was a singular outside pressure, but obviously it was working on something that was already within me. But I remember having a good friend who he was a graduate from Dickinson, and he was a couple of years ahead of me, and he had already gone off to law school, and he came back to visit, and I was asking him about law school, and I was also lamenting because I had gotten like a C- in American literature. I have to confess, Lolita really did me in. And I was talking to him about this and saying, oh my goodness, you know, I hope this doesn't mean I can't write. I hope this doesn't mean I can't go to law school. I hope all these doubts and all these fears that I had were bubbling to the surface. And he said to me, Amy, I'm in law school, and you have to understand, if you really are serious about law school, you have to stop thinking you can write in your own voice and hone that and get ready for law school. Like you have to kind of cut that part of you out. And so I took that to heart. I remember that very specifically. I took that to heart, and I, like I said, I boxed everything up and I just kind of continued on my path. So I still think there was another way, but at that time I was very vulnerable to advice like that.
Wonderful. Our next question, how did you find the best way to transition into publishing your work?
Yes, well, we could have a whole nother much longer discussion about that. I have often said that my journey to publication is somewhat orthodox, but I've sort of stopped saying that, because what I've learned is that everyone's journey to publication is so individual. The publishing industry itself has changed so much in the last decade. Probably it's changed so much in the last couple of years, and now it's changing so much, of course. But it's changed so much that I think what were thought to be traditional routes have evolved and expanded. So I actually sold my first book without an agent, which is kind of unusual. I was introduced to a small publisher who was a veteran publisher, but I was introduced to her by a friend who was a former magazine editor in New York City. So I had some connections in the business, and so I, you know, when I met her, I then, because I was a lawyer, I negotiated my own contract without an agent. Later, I did get a literary agent after my first book was sold, and I've had an agent for my other books. But when people come to me and ask, you know, how can I get a book published, I don't really use my example or the example of anyone I know as sort of the roadmap, because everyone has to sort of make their own unique journey. But you have to research, you have to do the research, and you have to understand the business of publishing and keep abreast of it. And so Publishers Weekly and Publishers Marketplace are great places to start. And I started going to a lot of writing conferences, and I started meeting a lot of professional commercial writers and talking to them about their paths, and really putting the work in. It's unique. And also self-publishing is definitely has become an avenue that's available to many, but it certainly does not remove the need for research, and I have a lot of friends who have really put a lot of hard work into self-publishing to make sure that that's a successful route too. So hard work, and something Dickinson prepares you well for, though.
That's wonderful. Our next question, what challenges have you faced as a writer balancing other roles and responsibilities? How did you ensure that you found time to be alone and concentrate on your work?
I love that. I love that. So when I first got my book contract, I actually got 2 contracts at the same time. I got the contract for my first novel at the same time I got a contract to write my first nonfiction book. And so the novel was written, but still needed to be finished going through the editing process. And then my nonfiction book had to be written completely. And I was at the time working. I did have a day job. I was working for the startup company, and I did quit that job so that I could write full time. And I repainted a room in my house and thought that was going to be my writing office. And I did sort of treat it like the place where I was going to hide from everyone and go there and find my quiet time. It didn't exactly work out that way. That room has become like a storage room. It's a beautifully painted, furnished storage room basically right now, because the idea of getting quiet time, where I have 3 children, they're all middle school and teenagers now. The idea of getting large blocks of quiet time is hard fought, but this is what I do. I am unapologetic about it. So I really do try to carve out not necessarily 8-hour blocks of time a day, but and now I do write alongside a day job. I'm a development officer for a parochial school, and I really do try to carve out my blocks of time to write at night, weekends, early morning, and I'm very protective of them, and I do not succumb to guilt, even when guilt is tried to be placed upon me for grabbing those times. And for me, it really is a form of self-care, especially now. It's become even more so a really important part of my self-care routine. So I am very militant about holding on to it and grabbing it for myself and preserving it.
Right, I think we have time for one last question. It is interesting that you found your voice after you left law and when you started writing, that you advocated for yourself, for your sabbatical, and were able to win the argument even when you were told no. That's impressive. I'd love to hear how you came to stand up for yourself in that environment and ask for what you wanted.
Well, I have to tell you, when I look back on it, that was probably a huge moment for me, because it was a very difficult environment to demand something just for myself. And I practiced law for over 13 years. I was a clerk for a federal judge in DC, and then I worked for a smaller kind of boutique firm doing corporate litigation. And then I worked for Skadden Arps for a decade. And if you know anything about Skadden Arps, it's not an easy environment. It's a very typical big law firm, and it was a very grueling, demanding schedule. And I had all 3 of my children there. So by the time I left there, I had 3 kids, 5 and under. But I had to really swallow my own voice a lot of that decade, because the expectations were that I would be very much at service to the clients and the firm itself, and I really didn't have a life outside of that firm. I really tried to protect very much my children and my time with my children, but that was a struggle. And that was part of why I wanted to take that sabbatical. I mean, a lot of people were telling me it's a crazy time to demand a sabbatical, because after the Lehman Brothers collapse, I mean, the uncertainty in New York was so high, and the worry of everyone, and especially all lawyers, and especially at my level, we were all, like senior associates, on the partnership track. I mean, but we weren't partners yet. So the worries were high about the future of our legal careers. But the truth was, I wanted that sabbatical for my kids and for my family. I wanted a year with them. And so I really, probably that was a big turning point for me, and probably the demanding and the arguing for myself to take that year was a big milestone for me that I'm sure helped open the floodgates that eventually were opened during that sabbatical. And then because I had fought so hard for it, that year was so precious to me. I did not want to waste one single minute of it. I didn't know that I wasn't going to go back to my firm at the end of that year. When I left, I literally just turned the lights off, but everything stayed. It wasn't until like 2 years later that I actually sent for my things and had my office cleaned out. When I left, I just turned the light off and closed the door and left for what was supposed to be just a year. And so I was so adamant that everything I did that year had to be intentional, had to be well thought out. Even if I didn't know exactly where I was going to be at the end of the year, every next step had to be really thoughtful and intentional. So yeah, I think that arguing for myself in that moment was probably the first time I had argued and not back down, probably in about a decade at that point.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking the time today for that wonderful reading and discussion. I thought it was wonderful. And thank all of you for joining us too today. This will be recorded should you have friends who missed out on the first opportunity but want to see it later. And Amy, thank you for your offer for continued conversation and keeping in touch as well. And I hope
Thank you. Yes, I'm sharing my email address, so you're welcome to share my email address and my website, and anyone's free to keep in touch.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you all very much. I hope we'll see you at another one of our programs very soon. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for doing this. Thank you.